History tends to remember the big, flashy names, right? But what about the folks who did all the essential, nitty-gritty work and then just kind of faded away? Well, today, we're going to pull one of those names out of the shadows and right into the spotlight. So, let's get into it. Okay, so our whole story kicks off with a pretty modern clue. Back in 2016, a magazine for the New Jersey Freemasons announced this new award they'd created. They called it the Brierley Award. Now, that immediately begs the question, right? Who in the world was Brierley? And what could he have possibly done that was so important that people are naming awards after him more than 2 centuries after he died? Well, to figure that out, we've got to jump in the time machine. We're heading all the way back to the founding of America, specifically to the hot, sticky summer of 1787. We're going to the Constitutional Convention where a guy from a pretty small state was about to leave a massive mark on the future of the nation. All right, let's meet the man of the hour, David Brierley. Now look, he wasn't one of those rock star founders you hear about all the time, like Washington or Madison. But trust me, he was right there in the middle of everything, right from the start. And let me tell you, this guy's resume was seriously impressive. He was a lawyer, a colonel in the state militia, and we're talking about someone who saw actual combat at places like Brandywine and Monmouth. By 1779, he's the Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. So yeah, this was a man who had some serious street cred long before he showed up in Philadelphia for that big convention. So picture this. Brierley shows up at the Constitutional Convention with the hopes of his entire state, New Jersey, basically resting on his shoulders. And he walks straight into what was, without a doubt, the single biggest fight of the whole event. And this right here, this was the fundamental conflict that almost blew up the United States before it even got off the ground. On one side, you had the big states like Virginia saying representation should be based on population. Simple, right? More people, more power. But for the small states like Brierley's New Jersey, that was a total nightmare. They were pushing for equal representation. Every state gets the same vote because they were terrified of getting completely steamrolled. And here, we get to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. This is Brierley laying out exactly what was at stake. He argued, and he was super passionate about this, that if the big states got their way, the small states would basically have zero power. They'd just be forced to cozy up to a bigger state to have any influence at all, completely losing their own voice in the process. His refusal to back down was a huge reason they finally reached what we now call the Great Compromise. The House of Representatives based on population, and the Senate where every state gets an equal say. But believe it or not, Brierley's biggest impact might have come from something that happened totally behind the scenes. He was on a committee with, and I'm not kidding, one of the most boring names you could possibly imagine, but its job, it was anything but. He was put on something called the Committee on Postponed Parts. I mean, seriously, it sounds like the place where they sent all the boring leftover problems nobody wanted to deal with, right? Wrong. This committee basically invented the modern American presidency. We're talking creating the office of the vice president, figuring out how long a president's term should be, and yeah, even giving the thumbs up to the electoral college system. And David Brierley, he was right there in the room when all those massive decisions were made. So, okay, he helped shape Congress and the presidency. That's a huge deal. But Brierley's influence didn't stop there, not even close. For his most, let's say, ahead of its time contribution, we've got to rewind a bit, back to when he was Chief Justice in New Jersey. Okay, quick sidebar for a really important legal idea, judicial review. All it means is that courts have the power to look at a law passed by the legislature and say, nope, this violates the Constitution, so it's void. It's basically the ultimate check and balance on lawmakers. Now, most of us, if we remember our history class, probably connect judicial review with that famous Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison from 1803. But check this out. This shows just how revolutionary Brierley was. All the way back in 1779, that's 24 years earlier, his court in New Jersey established that very same principle. He was laying down a legal precedent that would eventually become the foundation for the power of the entire U.S. federal court system. Just wow. Okay, so let's recap. We've got a soldier, a key founder at the convention, and a pioneering judge. So the big question is, why have most of us never even heard of this guy? I mean, think about it. He went to bat for the small states so they wouldn't get silenced. He helped literally design the office of the president, and he championed the idea of judicial review decades before it was the law of the land. But the tragic reality is he died from an illness in 1790. He was only 45 years old. He never got to see the government he worked so hard to build really get going, and he never became that big national name. And here's a really fascinating little detail from back then. One of his fellow delegates described him not as brilliant, but as a good man. He wasn't the guy giving the show-stopping speeches or seen as some kind of political mastermind. He was just seen as a solid, dependable, principled guy. And you know what? Maybe that's the real takeaway here. Brayley's story isn't about flashy genius. It's about just doing the work. He wasn't trying to get his name in the history books with big speeches. He was the guy sitting in those long, boring committee meetings. He was heading up conventions, making tough calls from the judge's bench. He was doing the hard, necessary, and let's be honest, pretty unglamorous work that it takes to actually build a country. And that brings us full circle, right back to that award in New Jersey. It wasn't just about remembering some forgotten name. It was about honoring that quiet, heads-down, essential work that actually holds everything together. David Brearley's life is a perfect reminder that for every famous name we all know, there were countless others just like him doing the heavy lifting. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How many other people who were absolutely essential to building our world are just sitting there, hidden in the footnotes, waiting for someone to tell their story?